Welcome to Dead Scary Stories. If you enjoy these stories, please like, share and subscribe. Also comment where and what time you're watching from. Now lie back, relax and let sleep consume you. The new city was meant to be a fresh start for her. I hadn't followed her, not immediately anyway. It wasn't like I knew exactly where she was either. She'd done a good job of cutting ties, no contact, not even a chance for me to explain myself, but I knew her. I knew the way she thought. When I eventually pieced it together, I knew she'd picked somewhere nondescript, a place where nobody asked questions, somewhere far from the noise of what had happened between us. I only found out where she'd gone by accident. Mutual friend, someone who didn't know everything, mentioned her name in passing, said she'd up and vanished. It took a few late nights trawling through social media, connecting the dots. Then I had it. A new flat in a quiet neighborhood, some middle-of-nowhere rental that she thought would be enough to disappear. She probably thought she'd blend in, become invisible. I'd never planned on staying. I just needed to see her. Not to confront her, not really. Just to remind her I was still there. To prove that no matter where she went, she couldn't just erase me. I rented a place nearby, a studio flat with peeling wallpaper and a faint stench of damp. It wasn't much, but it did the job. I spent my days laying low, getting the measure of her street, her building, her routines, watching from across the road, noting the times her lights went on and off, the rare occasions she ventured outside. She wasn't making friends, wasn't socializing. That was typical of her. She'd always had this idea that she didn't need anyone. It started with the knock. 3 sharp raps, then 2 lighter ones. The same way I'd always knocked when I'd come home late or when she didn't answer her phone. It was a habit. Nothing more. Muscle memory. A message without words. It's me. I didn't expect her to answer, of course. I wasn't there to be let in. I wanted her to feel it, though. To hear it and know it, to wonder. I stood at her door for a few seconds after each knock, imagining her frozen on the other side, the realization dawning. I could almost see her standing there, rigid, her chest rising and falling. The next morning, I stayed nearby, blending in with the foot traffic. I saw her leave for work. Saw the way she hesitated when she locked the door. She checked the handle twice, pulling it harder than necessary, her head turning just slightly to glance over her shoulder. The tampering had been easy. I hadn't forced the lock or made it obvious. Just a small nudge, a fraction of a turn. Enough to make her doubt herself, to make her wonder if she'd been careless. When she came back later that evening, I saw the moment it clicked. The way her body tensed, how she stood in front of the door, motionless for just a beat too long. She pressed her forehead against it before unlocking it, her movements slow and precise. When she stepped inside, she slammed it shut behind her. By the 3rd night, I could tell she hadn't slept much. Her light stayed on until the small hours, and even from the street, I could sense her restlessness. She must have heard the knocks again, same pattern as before. I didn't linger. Once the sound had done its work, I slipped away into the shadows of the street. The police came the following day. I spotted the patrol car parked outside as I sipped coffee at a nearby cafe. 2 officers followed her up to the flat, their posture indifferent, their voices low and dismissive. I imagined what they'd said to her, probably something about neighborhood kids or a noisy neighbor. She looked pale when they left, her movements stiff and jerky as she bolted the door behind them. It was working. The power outage wasn't planned, not by me, but it was an opportunity. The building was old and the electrics were unreliable. I noticed the street lamp outside flickering earlier in the evening, and when the block went dark just after 9, I couldn't help but smile. I'd let myself in earlier that day when I knew she'd be out. It wasn't hard. The locks were cheap and I'd been careful, leaving everything just as it was. I didn't want her to know I'd been inside. Not yet. I was waiting in the wardrobe of her bedroom when I heard her come back that evening. The shuffle of her shoes on the hallway floor, the rattle of her keys. She moved through the flat slowly, her breathing shallow and uneven. She must have reached for the light switch in the kitchen first, then the sitting room. Nothing. I could picture the tension in her shoulders as she realized the power was out. She'd have been weighing her options, wondering whether to call the landlord or wait it out. She didn't come to the bedroom straight away. I could hear her movements through the thin walls, the faint creak of floorboards as she checked the windows. Locked them tighter, maybe. She wasn't thinking straight, though. People never do when they're afraid. I didn't knock that night. She was in bed when she realized she wasn't alone. The wardrobe door was slightly ajar. just enough for me to see her face in the dim light from the street lamp outside. Her eyes were wide, her chest rising and falling like a rabbit caught in a snare. I stayed perfectly still. There was a moment when I thought she'd bolt, make a run for it, but she didn't. She just sat there, clutching the duvet to her chest. Paralyzed by the weight of what she couldn't see, I stayed until I couldn't feel my legs anymore, until I was certain she wouldn't move. Then, just as carefully as I'd come in, I slipped out, leaving her there in the dark. I don't know if she slept that night. I parked my car 2 streets over, as I always did. From there, I had a clear view of her flat through the narrow gap between the houses. It wasn't much, just a sliver of a view, but it was enough. I could see her silhouette when she passed the window. I could tell when her lights went on, when they went off. It had become a habit. A bad one, maybe, but I wasn't hurting anyone. I told myself that often. I just wanted to know she was okay. The nights were the worst. The way her window lit up the dark made her flat feel like a beacon, like it was pulling me towards her. It wasn't long before I started coming here every evening after work, eating cold sandwiches in the car, staring at that same window. I started to notice the little details, the way she always left her blinds tilted just so, open enough to let some light spill out, but closed enough to keep the world at bay. The way her front door was always locked by 8, no matter what. The way she sometimes stood in the kitchen, silhouetted in the glow of the fridge, as if she couldn't decide what to eat. Those were the moments when I felt closest to her again, even though we were apart. When she started seeing someone new, I recognized him from the coffee shop near her place. I'd seen them together there once, laughing over mugs of cappuccino. He was tall, dark-haired, better looking than me. I watched her laugh at something he said, her head tilting back just so, and something inside me curdled. He didn't deserve her, not the way I did. He hadn't put in the time. He hadn't been there for her in the bad times, the times when she was so sad she couldn't get out of bed for days. He hadn't held her hand when her mum got sick. He was just some guy, just a placeholder. It wasn't fair. One night, his car pulled into the driveway outside her flat, and I saw him knock on her door. She opened it, all smiles, and let him in. The light inside spilled out briefly before the door closed again. I sat in my car for hours that night, my fingers gripping the steering wheel so tight they started to cramp. When he left, just past midnight, I followed his car as he drove away, keeping my headlights off until he was well out of sight. After that, I started keeping track of his comings and goings too. It wasn't hard. He had a routine. Most people do when you pay attention. I knew when he went to the gym, when he stopped by the supermarket. Even the nights he stayed over at hers, those were the worst nights. I'd sit in my car, staring at the darkened windows of her flat, knowing he was in there with her, sleeping in the bed that used to be mine. The thought of it made my skin itch, but I didn't do anything. Not yet. I just watched, waiting for my chance. That chance came on a Friday night when she was supposed to meet him for dinner at a little Italian place near the high street. I'd overheard her tell a friend about it a few days earlier, back when I'd been close enough to her at the bus stop to catch snippets of her conversation. I parked my car across the street from the restaurant that night, hidden in the shadow of an old oak tree. I watched as she arrived, alone, standing outside the restaurant and checking her phone. She looked beautiful, dressed in a red coat that I remembered buying for her on a trip to Brighton. He never showed. I made sure of that. I waited until she gave up and started walking home, her arms folded tight against the chill in the air. I stayed in my car until I saw her lights flick on through the gap between the houses. Then I made my move. Her flat was on the ground floor. The little path leading up to her front door was lined with overgrown lavender bushes, and the scent of them seemed almost too strong in the cold night air. I knocked on her door and stepped back, giving her space. When she opened it, her expression was a mix of surprise and something else, something like recognition. I told her I deserved another chance. I don't remember exactly what happened after that. I remember stepping inside, the way the warmth of her flat enveloped me. I remember the smell of her perfume, faint but still there, like a ghost. I remember her trying to tell me something, her eyes wide, her lips moving, but the words didn't reach me. And then there was the sound of something breaking, glass maybe. A wine glass knocked off the counter, or a picture frame, I can't be sure. It all blurred together. When I left her flat, the street was silent. Her window was dark again. I got into my car and drove away, but my mind was blank, as if the night had swallowed the last few hours whole. I don't know what I expected to feel, relief maybe, or closure. Instead, there was just a strange hollowness, like the absence of a sound you didn't realize you'd been hearing. I parked my car 2 streets over again. Just for a moment, I told myself, just long enough to catch one last glimpse of her flat. But the light never came back on. The last time I saw Katie, she was laughing at something on her phone, her hair falling across her face like it always did. It was late in the day and the sky outside her window was already slipping into that greyish blue that comes before proper night. She looked so at ease, sitting there in the corner of her sofa, bare feet tucked beneath her, the dim light from her floor lamp catching the silver in her necklace. I remember thinking, I wasn't supposed to be there. I know how that sounds. I hadn't seen her in nearly 2 years, not in person anyway. I knew better than to approach her outright. The restraining order made sure of that. But sometimes, late at night, I'd scroll through her social media, zooming in on the pictures she posted, wondering who took them, where she was when they were snapped. It became a habit, a quiet compulsion, and when that wasn't enough anymore, I started visiting. Not every day, not even every week, just when the itch got bad. Her house was easy enough to find. She moved after we split, of course, but not far. A little terrace house on a quiet street, the kind with neatly clipped hedges and narrow front gardens. I learned her new address from the post she made when she first moved in, a photo of her keys dangling from her hand with a caption about fresh starts. I made it a point to keep my distance. I never went inside her gate or touched anything. I just watched, making note of her routine, when she left for work, when she came home, whether her lights stayed on late or switched off early. It gave me a sense of comfort knowing her life was still predictable. Still Katie. Then she changed her phone number. I only knew because the last text I sent her came back undeliverable. I panicked for a while, my chest tightening as though someone had cut the string tethering me to her. So I started calling, not to speak, just to hear her pick up. When the line connected and the background sounds spilled through, music, the television, the faint creak of her floors, it gave me a sense of being there even if she didn't know I was on the other end. But she stopped answering. Then she blocked the number. I told myself it was fine. She was safe. I was just checking, that was all. It wasn't like I meant to hurt her. I wasn't the villain she painted me as when we broke up. I was just someone who didn't know how to let go. Someone who loved her a little too much. The night her friend disappeared, I'd been outside her house for a while. It was cold, and I remember standing there with my hands shoved deep in my jacket pockets, rocking on my heels to keep warm. Her friend had arrived earlier in the evening. A blonde woman, shorter than Katie, dressed in jeans and a jumper. I hadn't seen her before, but Katie greeted her at the door like they were close. They went inside, and the curtains in the living room stayed open just enough for me to see the two of them sitting on the sofa, talking and laughing. I wasn't planning to stay long. I never stayed long, but something about seeing her with someone else, someone who wasn't me, made it hard to walk away. I stood across the street behind the hedge where the street lamp didn't quite reach, watching until the night deepened and the traffic thinned. Around midnight, the blonde woman stepped out onto the front porch. She was on her phone, the glow of the screen lighting up her face. She glanced around, but she didn't notice me. No one ever noticed me. She stayed there for a while, shivering in the cold before going back inside. A little later, the lights in the house went out. I should have left then, but I didn't. The house was quiet still, the way it always got when Katie slept. I waited, watching the windows, counting the hours until the faintest smear of dawn began creeping into the sky. That's when I noticed the front door was ajar, just a sliver, but enough to make my pulse quicken. I crossed the street and stood at the bottom of the steps, peering at the darkened doorway. There were no sounds from inside, no movement. I stared at it for a long time, trying to decide if I should go up. It wasn't like her to leave the door open. Katie was careful, cautious. But before I could make up my mind, I heard the faintest crunch of gravel from the alley behind the house. I turned, scanning the narrow passageway. Nothing moved, but there was a sense of something just beyond the edges of what I could see, something that didn't belong. The hair on my arms stood on end. My throat tightened, and for the first time in all my nights spent watching, I felt exposed. I left then, my steps brisk, head down. The whole way home I kept looking over my shoulder, though I couldn't say why. By the time I reached my flat, I was shaking, my palms damp with sweat. I locked the door behind me and collapsed onto the sofa, the flicker of the television the only light in the room. The news broke the next morning. Katie's friend hadn't shown up for work and her car was found abandoned on a rural road, the engine still warm. Her phone was on the passenger seat, screen cracked, battery drained. The police released footage later that week, a grainy clip from a neighbour's security camera showing a man outside Katie's house in the early hours of the morning. He was tall, dressed in dark clothes, his face partially obscured by a hood. He didn't move much, just stood there, looking at the house. It was me. Of course it was me. I knew that, but no one else does. The flat I'd rented was a dump. The walls were thin, the ceiling had a damp spot that spread outwards like a map of nowhere, and the boiler rattled whenever it felt like it. It suited me fine, though. It was quiet most of the time, tucked at the back of an old terraced row with no neighbours too close. I didn't need much, I just needed to be left alone, except of course I wasn't alone. Not really. The house was always with me in my head, not the flat, but her house. The one she had taken with her, along with the boy. Our boy. She'd acted like she could just shut the door on me, and that was the end of it, but it wasn't. You don't just walk away from something like that. Families aren't so easily broken. I hadn't meant to go back, I really hadn't. The first few weeks after she left, I stayed away, keeping to the rules the court set out, biting my tongue when I wanted to say otherwise. But it gnawed at me. The nights were the worst. Lying there on the lumpy mattress, staring at the water-stained ceiling, I kept picturing him, my son. Sleeping in that room I'd painted with my own hands, lying in the cot we'd picked out together. A camera pointed down at him, a little plastic intruder replacing me. I'd driven past the house a few times by then. I told myself it was just curiosity, nothing more. It's not like I'd gone in, but that night, something felt different. The flat was quiet, too quiet, and the walls seemed closer than usual. Before I realized it, I was in the car. The house was dark when I got there. Her car wasn't in the driveway. My fingers tightened on the steering wheel as I stared at the front window. The faint glow from inside telling me she'd left a light on somewhere. It was like it was calling me. I sat there for a long time, longer than I'd meant to. The keys to the house were still on my key ring. She hadn't changed the locks yet. I told myself I'd just look around. Nothing else. Just make sure everything was how it should be. I parked a little way down the street, slipped the key into the lock and stepped inside. It felt the same, and it didn't. My shoes made soft sounds on the carpet as I moved through the hall, past the living room with its furniture arranged just as we'd left it, and to the stairs. Upstairs, the door to his room was slightly ajar, the light from the little owl-shaped nightlight spilling out in a soft pool. The cot was just as I remembered, standing in the corner near the window. I stepped closer and saw him lying there, his little hands resting by his head, his tiny chest moving. He looked so peaceful, so small. I couldn't help it. I reached down and lifted him into my arms. He stirred, but didn't wake. His warmth spread through me, and I felt something deep inside settle. This was right. This was how it was supposed to be. I held him close and started to whisper to him, telling him how much I loved him, how I wasn't going to let him grow up thinking his dad wasn't there. Then, out of nowhere, I felt a prickle at the back of my neck, like the air in the room had shifted. I turned my head and saw the camera. It was perched on a shelf, its little lens aimed squarely at me. The red light glowed faintly. It was watching me. It had been this whole time. I hadn't thought about it when I'd come in, but now I couldn't stop thinking about it. She could be watching from her phone or recording me, ready to show the footage to the police. I glared at it, still cradling my son. My voice rose a little as I spoke to the room, not knowing if she could hear me, but not caring either. Then something shifted behind me, not loud, but noticeable. A movement somewhere in the hall. My head snapped around and my breath caught in my throat. The door to the room was open wider than it had been, and beyond it the dark of the hallway seemed thicker somehow. I stared into it, barely breathing. There was nothing there, no sound, no sign of movement, but my gut twisted all the same. The air felt sharper, colder, and I felt the urge to turn back to the cot. But I didn't. The nightlight flickered, not much, just enough for me to notice. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch further than they should. My grip on the baby tightened. I turned back to the cot, my movements jerky and quick. The blanket was lying in a heap, bunched in one corner. The camera clicked, a soft sound, like a mechanical eye adjusting. The red light blinked off, leaving the lens blank. My chest tightened as I stood there, staring at the little black circle. It was dead now. No light, no recording. I took a step back, then another, still holding the baby. My knees felt weak. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. My legs refused to move. The door to the hallway creaked, and for a moment it felt like the air itself had shifted around me. I didn't stay. I couldn't. I turned and stumbled out of the room, my heart pounding, and made my way down the stairs as quickly as I could without dropping him. When I got back to the car, I realized I was trembling. My hands shook as I fumbled with the car keys, trying to fit them into the ignition. I didn't look back at the house as I drove away. I couldn't. The baby stirred in my arms, his little face peaceful. For a moment, I felt a flicker of something almost like relief. Then I glanced at the baby monitor lying in the passenger seat where I'd tossed it earlier. The red light on it was on. The flat was supposed to be her clean slate. That's what she told everyone anyway. New locks, new address, fresh start. She'd picked a place that wasn't too fancy, but not shabby either. One of those new builds with white walls and spotless countertops. Sterile, clinical, the sort of place that made it easy to pretend nothing bad had ever happened there. That was her way, though. She always liked to act like everything could be reset, like she could just cut ties, pack boxes, and pretend the past didn't exist. I wasn't part of her plan, obviously. She'd made sure of that. Changed her number, blocked me on everything, moved without telling anyone who might tell me. It didn't take long to figure out where she'd gone, though. I'd always had a knack for reading her. Besides, people talk. It's surprising what you can piece together if you're patient. I told myself I wouldn't bother her. I just needed to know she was okay. That's all. No harm in that. I never wanted things to end the way they had. She didn't understand what we had, not really. I thought maybe if I gave her space, she'd come around. But space is a funny thing. Too much of it, and it starts to feel like a wall. It wasn't planned the night I came back. I'd been out driving around the city, not really thinking about where I was going, just driving. My hands on the wheel, my thoughts drifting. Her face came to me then, the way it always did, her laugh, the way she tilted her head when she was pretending not to be cross. It felt like she was right there in the car with me. Before I knew it, I was parked outside her building. It was late. The windows were all dark except one on the second floor, her flat. I could see the faint glow of a lamp through the curtains, the kind of light that stays on when someone falls asleep in front of the telly. My chest tightened. I told myself it was just a quick look, just one. The lock on the building door was laughable. A little wiggle with the flat of a key and I was in. Her door was locked too, but the gap under it was wide enough for me to slide the spare key she didn't know I still had. It took me a second to unlock it, the faint metallic sound of the mechanism turning in the silence. Inside, the air smelled of her. Shampoo, laundry soap, and that faint floral perfume she used to dab on her wrists. It hit me like a fist to the gut. I didn't even notice the rest of the flat at first. It was all white walls and sleek furniture anyway, nothing personal, nothing like the place we'd shared. Her bedroom door was half open, and the light from the lamp in the lounge spilled in just enough for me to see her. She was asleep, curled on her side, her face tucked into the pillow. She looked so small, so still. For a moment I just stood there, my hands clenched into fists, then I turned and left. I don't know what made me come back. Maybe it was the smell of her. The way it clung to me even after I'd gone, or maybe it was how peaceful she'd looked. Like she hadn't even missed me. Either way, I couldn't stay away. The next time, it wasn't enough just to look. I stepped further in. Her flat was spotless, not a thing out of place. The fridge was half empty, its contents lined up like soldiers. I moved through the rooms, careful not to leave a trace, careful not to disturb her. I just wanted to feel what it was like to be part of her life again, even if she didn't know I was there. It became a habit after that. Every few nights when the city was quiet and the streets were empty, I'd find myself outside her building. She never woke, not even when I sat in the lounge and breathed in the scent of her shampoo from the sofa cushions. Not even when I stood over her bed close enough to hear the soft sound of her breathing. Then one night I noticed something. She'd started sleeping with her bedroom door shut. At first I thought it might be a coincidence. Maybe she'd gotten cold. Maybe she'd changed her routine. But when I let myself in, the lock on the bedroom door was new. My jaw tightened. She must have noticed something. I thought about leaving that night, about walking out and never coming back. But the thought of her locking me out, of her cutting me off again, it made something twist inside me, so I stayed. I slipped through the flat, making my way to the kitchen. I'd make her breakfast, something familiar, something to remind her. I didn't hear her until she was standing there in the doorway, her face pale in the dim light. Her eyes were wide, her breath coming in short bursts. For a moment, neither of us moved. I smiled at her. Her phone was in her hand, shaking. I could see her thumb hovering over the screen. She was going to call someone. I took a step forward. The air between us felt sharp, electric. I reached out. She dropped the phone. I've always been a man of routine, a creature of habit. That's what she used to say about me. She said it with a smile when she loved me, and with a grimace when she didn't. But routines are comforting, aren't they? They keep things predictable, manageable. I suppose that's why I did what I did, why I kept coming back, even after she changed the locks. It's not that I thought she'd take me back, not exactly. I'm not stupid. I knew it was over, even when I didn't want it to be, but when someone's been part of your life for so long, it's hard to let go of the rituals. Even harder when you can see the proof that she already has. The blocked number, the deleted photos, the friends who cross the street when they see you coming. I kept my distance, though. For weeks I stayed away. No calls, no emails, no sitting in my car outside her flat. I promised myself I wouldn't give her another reason to hate me, and I meant it. But then, last night, something changed. I was lying in bed in my flat, staring at the crack in the ceiling that's been there since I moved in. I don't remember falling asleep, but I woke up to the sound of water running. A faint trickle, distant but unmistakable. My heart kicked up, and for a moment I thought I was still dreaming. Then I recognized it. The steady stream of a shower. I sat up, blinking in the dark, trying to figure out where it was coming from. My flat's small, just a bedroom, a kitchen and a bathroom tucked behind a flimsy sliding door. The shower shouldn't have been running. I hadn't been in there since morning, and I never leave it on. The thought made me uncomfortable, like I'd forgotten something important. I stood up, padding across the carpet to check. When I opened the bathroom door, the sound stopped. Just like that. Silence, except for the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. The tiles were dry. I stared at the shower head for a long moment. The faint outline of it lit by the street lamp outside the window. Nothing dripped. Nothing was wet. I told myself it was in my head, that maybe I'd been dreaming after all, but it didn't feel like a dream. It didn't feel like anything, really, just off. I went back to bed, pulling the duvet up to my chin, and tried not to think about it. I didn't sleep much after that. This morning, everything was normal. I got up, made coffee, went to work. I didn't think about the shower, or her, or the flat we used to share. I didn't let myself think about anything at all. When I got home, it was dark. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and flicked on the light. The bulb buzzed, dimmer than usual. I closed the door behind me and kicked off my shoes, heading to the kitchen. That's when I noticed it. There, on the counter, was a folded stack of clothes. It took me a second to realize what I was looking at. Jeans, a t-shirt, socks, neatly folded, like they'd just come out of the wash. I didn't own any of them, but I knew them. I knew them. I felt the air leave my lungs as I stared. The jeans were frayed at the cuffs. The t-shirt faded and stretched out around the collar. The socks were mismatched. I'd seen her wear that exact outfit 100 times before, lounging on the sofa or curled up in bed. She hadn't been here. She couldn't have been here. I stood there for a long time, the fridge humming behind me, the clothes sitting motionless under the faint glow of the kitchen light, and then I noticed the smell. It was faint but unmistakable, the metallic tang of water, damp and clinging to the air. I turned my head towards the bathroom door, just slightly ajar, and saw the curl of steam drifting out. I don't remember moving, but I must have, because the next thing I knew, I was standing in the doorway, staring at the fogged-up mirror and the closed shower curtain. The light above the sink flickered weakly. The sound of running water filled my ears. The tiles were wet now, slick with moisture that had started to seep out under the doorframe. My feet stuck to the floor as I stepped inside, one trembling foot in front of the other. I reached for the curtain, my hand hovered over it, and for a moment I thought about leaving, about grabbing my keys and walking out the door without looking back. But I didn't. I pulled the curtain back. The water poured from the shower head in a steady stream, hot and relentless, but that wasn't what made me freeze. It wasn't the steam filling the room or the wet footprints leading from the shower to the counter. It was the figure standing under the water. His back was to me, his shoulders hunched, the water soaking through his shirt and matting his hair to his skull. His arms hung limp at his sides, his hands pale and wrinkled. I stared, my mouth dry, as he turned around. It was me. My own face stared back at me, water dripping from my nose and chin, my eyes dull and lifeless. My lips moved soundlessly, as if trying to form words that wouldn't come. I stumbled back, my heart thundering in my chest, and tripped over the bath mat. When I hit the floor, the lights went out. By the time I scrambled to my feet, the bathroom was empty. The shower was off, the tiles were dry, and the clothes were gone. I was sitting on the edge of my bed, looking at the picture she'd posted of her new place. She'd always been one for the cozy touches, and this little house was no different. Fairy lights in the window, a welcome mat with a cheesy pun, and some potted plants out front. I could almost smell the lavender she probably had tucked away somewhere. It wasn't jealousy, not really. It was just frustrating. She always made things look so perfect, like she could just shed the past and move on without a second glance, without a glance at me. The day I found out where she lived wasn't planned. One of those mutual friends who didn't know how to navigate the post-breakup landscape casually mentioned her new address in passing. A housewarming party, they said. She'd invited a handful of friends to celebrate. I wasn't one of them, of course. Still, I wondered what the place looked like, how she'd arranged it, what she'd brought from our old flat and what she'd left behind. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was something else. Doesn't matter. I drove by late in the evening, parking down the road and walking the rest of the way. There were still a couple of cars outside, some laughter drifting faintly from the open window. I stayed out of sight, watching the soft glow of her living room lights spill across the front garden. It wasn't spying, not really. I just wanted to see. The party broke up a little before midnight. A few people left in pairs, chatting and stumbling towards their cars, their voices carrying over the quiet street. A couple of others left on foot. Then finally she appeared in the doorway. She stood there a moment, leaning on the frame like she was saying goodbye to the house guests she loved most. She didn't even lock the door straight away, which struck me as careless. But that was her all over, always trusting, always certain the world wouldn't take advantage. When the house went dark, I walked up to the porch, letting myself into the garden. Her curtains were drawn, but there was a gap in the one covering the front window. I peeked inside just for a moment. The living room was cozy and small, the kind of space where you'd want to curl up with a book and a cup of tea. There was a blanket folded over the back of the sofa, and one of those electric candles glowing faintly on the coffee table. Everything about it looked soft and warm. Homey, too homey, considering it had only been hers for a week. I hadn't planned on going in, but I did. I told myself it was harmless. I wasn't going to take anything, wasn't going to hurt her. Just wanted to see the place up close, to see if she'd left anything of me behind. I still had the spare key from when we were together. I don't know why I'd kept it. Maybe some part of me had hoped we'd end up fixing things and it would be useful again. The house smelled faintly of flowers. I walked through the living room to the kitchen, through the little hall. She had some of our old photos pinned to the fridge. I noticed one of us at Brighton Pier back when we'd been happy. It was the only one where my face wasn't cropped out. She'd added a little shelf in the hallway for her keys and wallet. A small touch, but it felt like her. The bedroom was the hardest part. Her duvet was the same one we'd shared, but the rest of the room was different. No sign of me at all. It was like I'd never been part of her life. That stung, even if I'd expected it. I don't know what came over me then. I took out my phone and snapped a picture. She was asleep, turned slightly on her side, peaceful, completely unaware. It wasn't for anything sinister. I didn't even know why I did it. Maybe just to prove I'd been there, that I still existed in her world, even if she'd scrubbed me out of it. I left the same way I'd come in. Quietly, carefully. I didn't think about it much after that. The next day I wrapped the photo in some leftover paper I found in my car, stuck it in a gift bag, and drove by her house again. I left it on her doorstep and walked away. I wasn't expecting her to know it was me. But when I heard later that she'd started asking questions, the thought gave me a strange sort of satisfaction. She'd never really understand, though. How could she?